Good morning. Thank you for tuning in to Hobby Hi-Fi. Here we are in mid-April, and found myself having to repair a couple of CD players lately, and stumbled upon a couple of old familiar scenarios that I ran into years back. I started this probably, I don't know, time has been flying, 20, 30 years ago. I got interested in this in the 80s while I was in high school. My buddy Roger was a speaker guru, and he used to build some speakers for us for high school dances, and custom out of 1-inch marine plywood. And they were, a couple 100 pounds a piece, stood 5 or 6 feet high, and really belted out that old sound reinforcement, Force 12 woofers, built for sound reinforcement. And we had a blast. And ever since, I've sort of taken the hobby and tried to have a little fun with it, make a little money on the side, and things like that. So I've sort of morphed away from speakers as they're bigger, harder to store, harder to ship, costly to ship, and things like that. So I've gone to CD players, and as you can tell, these are quite a bit smaller than a pair of speakers, and so will go in most boxes, and easy to ship, 20 bucks, and you're good to go. So what I come across, this is a player by Marantz, possibly late 90s, early 2000s. And Marantz is one of my favorite brands. And, CD players, I sort of stuck in the CD mode as far as a source goes. And so I've had quite a few CD players, and I enjoy trying them. They all have different digital to analog converters built in. They're all built a little bit differently. Some of them have nice big transformers here. Some of them are excellent transports. They're built a little bit heavier. They're built just a solid piece of equipment, unlike some of the things that I'm seeing today. So I've sort of stuck in the in CD players that are a little bit older. And in these older players, I'll say, 10 years to 20 years old, you'll find a lot of them having some issues, and 90% of the time, maybe even 95% of the time, the issues are all right in your drive assembly, I'm going to call this. Now, the nomenclature again is a little bit tricky, but I'm going to try to just sort of dissect some things that I've come across in the last couple days. And interestingly enough, a lot of the players in this ilk and this era, I guess, are using Sony drives. Whether or not the player is a Sony product, or whether it's NAD has used a lot of Sony drives. Marantz has used Sony drives. AMC has used Sony drives. I think Sony sort of had a lock on the CD drive mechanisms, and I'm not actually sure of all of the model numbers on these. I'm gonna call these drive assemblies, but they're all very similar. So a lot of these parts are interchangeable. So I'm gonna just sort of dissect this. Now this is sort of your. This has 2 screws on each end here, and as you're taking this apart, once you get your cover off, of course, you're gonna come down in here, and you'll see four screws holding this drive assembly into the chassis. So you want to pull those out, and you'll have a couple of clips here that you'll want to pull off your wire connectors off your board, and you'll have your ribbon. Sometimes these are ribbon cables. Now these are well, I don't know. I guess it's a standard wire connection here. and I kind of prefer those, as these ribbon cables can be a bit finicky. But you'll also want to remove this ribbon cable back in here and make sure that you keep that, so you know which way it went in and all that. So once you get that all removed and you get your screws, sometimes you'll have to jimmy this front face just a little bit, and this whole assembly will pop right out, and then you can get at it. So once you remove it, I guess it would look a little bit like this one here. And this is a similar drive, but a bit different optical pickup. You'll see here where your laser is just a bit of a different product here. But still, I believe this is still a Sony drive, and so that's what it'll look like when you get it completely out. Now, once you get it stripped down, you'll see that, you know, you've got your drive assembly without your pickup in it is going to look sort of like this, and so this is a Rotel unit that still, I believe, is using a Sony drive. So the thing that I wanted to sort of explain, well, I guess I should bring this part over. Now, I'm not exactly sure of the nomenclature again, but I think we need to, I think I've heard sled mentioned, and so we can call this a sled if you want. Now, the other question would be, you know, is this internal part the actual sled? Because it does ride on a couple of metal rails there. But this, as you can tell, I'm not sure if this one came in this package or not, but this is going to fit right in here, and typically there's a couple of slots that will sort of ride in right up in here. So when you're taking these apart, if you do have to sort of replace your laser, which is what I've been trying to do here, you'll have a couple of screws that hold this in on each side, here and here, and then this, I guess we'll call it a sled, will pop right out. And so a lot of times your issues are going to be, well, first of all, your belt is going to be 95, at least 90% of the time, your belt is going to be the issue. And what happens over time is that they just get stretched out, and they get loose, and they won't operate the mechanism as well. So let's see if I can get a better angle on this, because that belt is, yeah, I'm not going to be able to do, well, maybe I am. Let's see if this will slide right off. It should. I don't want to be too rough, but I think I've taken, yeah, well, I'm not going to get too crazy about this, but let's see if I can keep my lighting decent here. But as you look, there's a pin right in the back that's that needs to be removed, and there's a little it's a stop pin that will hit on these. If you look down in here, there's sort of a leaf spring type of situation, and that just tells the unit that it's in proper position. So if you don't remove this and you try to pull this tray off, that pin is going to hit on your spring. Again, nomenclature, but I believe these are just a leaf type of spring that has contacts in it. When that's moved just a little bit, and it'll tell the unit, you know, what where the drive in is in its sequence. But as far as the belt goes, pretty easily removed. Once you get this tray apart, your belt's going to be down in here. They're all pretty much the same size, and you've got a couple of pulleys, and so once you pop this little cover off down in here, you'll see your major gear that belt goes around, and then it'll that's pretty easily replaced if you can find one. Now those are all a little bit different depending on your model, but so anyway, it's a bit technical today and a bit tricky to explain and a bit tough to photograph all these situations. But a lot of times you'll also, or not a lot of times, but sometimes you, and recently I think I've come across this sort of a worm gear down here having a bit of a time, possibly damaged in shipping. So things in these plastic assemblies don't always travel well. And plastic is plastic, so they can break and they can sort of chip off these teeth. You know, it's a bit fragile at times. And so I had one that everything seemed to be working, but I have an idea that some of these, it just wasn't sort of aligning well down in here. So that's a tricky one. So in that case, you know, sometimes you have to actually replace your whole drive, because I'm not sure that you can really find parts and replace these types of things very easily. So anyway, it gets a little tricky, but most of it is common sense. And so anyway, when we get to this point and you've taken this out, we'll call it your sled. I'm just going to come over here and see if I can't set this down and give us a little bit of a rest. Okay, so if you've got to replace the laser pickup, again, nomenclature, we're going to call this the pickup, okay, or your laser. Now that rides on a rail over here that you can see, this little rail, and that is driven by the motor. There's a couple of motors. One will spin your shaft here, and the other one will spin this mechanism over here. And so what you've got to kind of do to get this laser off from there and replaced is, let me see if I can find my little tool here. All right. So you'll see down at this end of the mechanism, you'll see a bit of a plastic spring. Now, if you just stick something like a small tool, preferably pointed, as you can see, there's a bit of a hole there. This will spring right over. See if I can do it and show you the movement. Get my finger out of the way. Which finger is that? You see how that springs a bit? So that will actually move out of the way if you put a little pressure on that to allow you to slide this rail right out. So once that rail comes out of there and it slides back from this direction, your laser will be able to come off this rail, okay? And what you may need to do that is remove this gear here, and that's not a huge deal. When you flip this over, let's see if we can be a bit gentle here. When you flip that over, you'll see you've got this is where that gear comes through, and you've got a bit of a couple of ears here that if you pinch together with a pair of small needle nose pliers, or sometimes even with your fingers, you can just pinch that and push that through, and that that gear will pop off and it reinserts relatively easily. So that'll allow you to take your whole optical pickup off. Okay, so once you get that off, you can reverse that process, slide your new laser on, your new pickup, okay, right back where it came from, and hopefully you're in business. So I think we'll leave it at that. If we wanted to expound on this, I've hardly ever had any problems. Occasionally these motors go, you see there's a motor here and a motor there. But a lot of times if you do have troubles with anything here, which is not very likely, everything's pretty robust. But honestly, yeah, I'm trying to remember now. You may end up having to take this whole inner piece out of here. So this just sits in a plastic case. And I'm trying to recall if I had to do this last time or if I was able to get this laser out of here without taking this apart. I think I actually was. I think it was a tight fit to get this out. So at times I've had to remove this inner piece here, in which case you need to take these 4 screws off, okay? And 1, 2, where's 3? 3, 4. Now, one thing to note here, and this is something that's given me a bit of confusion in the past. See these springs here? This is what this whole mechanism rides on for damping. These are a golden color, and this would be considered the back of this mechanism. Now, as you look a little bit closer, these are silver. Okay, so what they've done here is they've chosen a bit of I believe these are a bit more compliant, if you will, a bit easier to spring on the front than they are the back. And so these are, I believe, a little bit heavier of a spring. So it's helpful to know that when you're putting this back together, that you've actually kept these springs where they're supposed to go. The other day I forgot, and I said, which way do these springs go? Is it gold in the front or gold in the back? And even being able to tell which is the front and the back is a bit tricky. So typically what this hooks into your to the front of your tray. So this with that worm gear. So, and this is your spindle here. So this is the front. So and hopefully I've got these right now, and I think I do. But be conscious of the way that comes out, so you can tell it, your front or back, and you keep your orientation so you know that these springs are actually not the same and they are a bit different. So that's going to help your sled ride more level to have those springs in the proper position. So once you've, if you do have to take this whole thing apart, it's not a huge deal. Those screws come out of there, and they just sit in a rubber grommet. You can sort of see down in here, you've got a bit of a rubber grommet that those springs sit in. Make sure that your springs are sitting in here properly. I noticed right along this line, the edge of this rubber grommet, that there was some indentations there that obviously at some point somebody or possibly I had not put those springs back properly and sort of had them off kilter, and they will again not be as level if they're not sitting in those grommets, those little rubber grommets perfectly straight. So anywho, a lot of times that when you run into problems with these drives, your issue over 20, 30 years is that this rail here will become gooped up. They typically use white lithium grease to keep this sort of moving freely on this rail. And so that white lithium grease will get hot, will sort of age, and will get thicker and stickier and not work as well. I typically like to clean these rails off. And so if the way this pickup is all the way to the other end, you clean this side, and then you can move this down, and then you can clean the other side of this rail up top. So you get a good chance. Take a Q-tip, some isopropyl alcohol, and remove all that white lithium grease. And honestly, in this situation, I think we've got metal to metal here. I think that this runs, this pickup has got sort of a metal sleeve in it. I kind of prefer like a sewing machine oil on these metal to metal situations. I'm not a big fan of white lithium grease. It's awful nice if you've got one of those little needle dispensers to just sort of put a thin bead down here and then on the other end, and let that work itself back and forth to sort of relubricate that rail. And that's one of the issues that you'll find when things are not they're in your intermittent skipping issues and things like that. It's getting sticky and it's not running down this rail easily and consistently. So anyway, let's see. So once you get if you have to replace your pickup, back in the day, a lot of these were labeled Sony pickups. And I don't know if I've got one here. Probably not, because I think what happened is they ended up being kind of knocked off by Chinese manufacturers. And I don't think they're ever as good. And I think a lot of people are in agreement with that. A lot of the older Sony stuff was made in Japan, and that's where I prefer my stuff to be made. However, if you can't find them and you got to buy stuff that's made in China, then I guess you have to. Now, right in here, on this side of the pickup, you'll see your model number for the pickup. So Sony part numbers, KSS. Whoa, I'm having some flashing going on. KSS 210A. Now this particular pickup is from I'm going to say an older Sony player. So I'm thinking that this is probably an original Sony drive, and that maybe your Sony label is under this little pad here. But in later years, they went to, and this one is going to be what I'm going to call the knockoff optical, because you don't see the word Sony printed on this top face right here. So I'm going to guess that this is a Chinese optical, but not positive of that. And here's your model number once again. Here's your potentiometer that sort of will adjust your the strength of your laser. This is something that a lot of people tell you to stay away from, because if you start fiddling with that, you're not able to really tell exactly where you're at. Now, if you're like me and you're not into oscilloscopes yet, and not exactly sure where to plug your multimeter in to test the the actual output of this laser, and that's a bit of a complicated measurement for me. I can do that by ear. Now, typically these seem to work okay, and a lot of times if I'm hearing, I kind of go by ear. And a lot of people are gonna tell them to laugh me out of the room on this one, but out of the box, I think you can sort of go by 10 o'clock position. If they come that way, I generally plug them in and see if they work okay. If they don't, I'll make some slight changes, shut it off, make the change, turn it back on, and see if maybe I've made an improvement as far as how that sounds and how it tracks and seeks. And you'll be able to tell if that laser is adjusted improperly, because it will pretty much not read. And so that's a bit of a trial and error situation that I'm a little scared to report, and don't recommend doing that. But if you have to and you don't have any other way to do it, and you're willing to learn, and you're willing to accept the fact that you may screw up your laser and have to buy another one, these are probably $20 to $40 nowadays, even for these knockoffs. I'm not sure you can actually find any that say Sony on the top anymore. But yeah, gets a little tricky. So anyway, I've had pretty good luck with these for the most part, but I did want to share something that I sort of forgot about. And over the years, I've learned some tricks. Let's see if I can get this to sit pretty. I've learned some tricks, and then I've forgotten some things. So the other day I went to replace a laser. I popped this out of the box. I put it in and it didn't work. And I said, that son of a gun sent me a defective product. Of course, I waited too long. It's out of the warranty or return period or whatnot. But then the light came on. And if you flip this over in this board, you will notice a blob down here. And as soon as I saw this blob, I went back over my notes, and maybe even on one of the boxes to one of these optics that look sort of like this. I had written on the box, "Don't forget to remove the blob." Well, I had forgotten to remove the blob, and this is what the blob looks like. So I couldn't do this very well using my front-facing camera, so I'm trying to use my rear-facing camera. The focus on these small items can be a bit tricky. But if you can tell, before my battery dies, there's two traces here. And what they've done is they've sort of blocked this. Now, I'm not exactly sure why they did this, but in the manufacturing, they put a blob on these to make sure that, I don't know, maybe it's so they can tell that this is a new product or hasn't been used before, or some sort of safety or for static issue. It's not focusing very well. But this will not allow this player to work, because there is a trace on the left, and there is a trace on the right, and a trace on the left. And you can see this is joining both of those traces. And so what you need to do is you need to get your trusty desoldering braid out, and you need to get your soldering gun, and you need to get that on there, and you need to remove that blob. And I found at least two of these optics that I had in boxes, that when I had forgotten all about this, I had taken these all apart, installed the new laser here, and it didn't work. And then I finally remembered, check the blob, and I found that on at least a couple of my units I had forgotten to take this blob off in there. So this unit will not work that way. So I wanted to share that for those of you that are trying to tinker on some of these older CD players and getting some replacement parts for them. You can deconstruct this. This is sort of down to its simplest parts now. But a lot of these things can be worked on and tweaked a little bit, and you can bring them back with a little bit of patience. What you want to do for the most part before I wrap this up is you want to stay away from any oil. I've tried to oil this is your spindle here, and I've gotten kind of cute and tried to just put a drop of oil on this. I wouldn't do it. This is where your disc rides, and the ability to, there's a clamp, one of the other pieces that I showed you earlier clamps down on this, and this is the home for your disc. And so any oil is gonna possibly keep that from spinning and picking up the way it should. That there's a magnet on the other side of this that does sort of provide a clamping mechanism here. But a lot of times I've kicked myself for ever applying any oil to this area whatsoever. So what I would recommend, if you're having some intermittent or skipping issues and your belt looks good and everything else is looking pretty good, take some isopropyl and a Q-tip and go in and clean this area off. This can get gooped up a little bit over the years, and this little rubber ring around the outside can get a little bit dirty, and that's where part of your grip comes from on your CD. So avoid any oil there. But sometimes if you do, you've got an old mechanism here and you're attempting to rejuvenate it and things aren't working well, if you need to and you find your little needle oil applicator that I like to use, maybe some kind of machine or sewing oil, this spindle motor is a good area to oil, because that's that's where it's spinning, and that generally isn't going to need anything, but sometimes you can put a drop of oil there and a drop of oil on your sled, and you can even put a drop of oil down in this little hole here. Again, that's something that gear is normally doped up with white lithium grease, and so whether I've been told to remove all the old white lithium grease. Sometimes I just say, well, I'll throw in a little machine oil on top of it, and I think it's better than nothing. So anyway, that's the deconstruction of our CD assembly by Sony, and a lot of times I'm coming across a lot of these same parts, the KSS series, the 210, as we showed you here. The 213 is another common one that I've been coming across, and the 213C. And they also have a lot of players that use the KSS 213B, so that there are some changes with these parts, so they're not all the same. I try to typically only replace those parts with identical parts, because I'm not exactly sure the difference. And somebody over my head that's worked on this and hooked these things up to some good testing equipment could tell you the difference between the 213B and the 213C, if there is in fact any. But my guess is that there is. So I've always tried to find the original parts, but I've had some success with some of these replacement parts, and I guess we can call them knockoff parts. But yeah, I thought that blob was an interesting subject to speak about. And sorry for the long-winded video here, but this is something that you're only going to come across if you're really serious about fixing that CD player of yours, and you're ready to start pulling things apart and taking not taking no for an answer. And so thank you for tuning in today. Thank you for your patience, and hopefully some of these camera angles will help explain some of the issues on these very common Sony drives that I've been running across in recent years. And honestly, I think that what I've decided is, since I am still able to find these optics occasionally, even though I'm not quite sure that they're made in Japan anymore. The whole assembly itself is quite robust, And I think it's good to know that some of your higher end companies relied on these Sony drives. Um, Somewhere, underneath there may be some numbers that I could find that might, on the tray or the outside mechanism, there may be some numbers that I could match up. But overall, Rotel, NAD, Marantz, some of your higher end players in this generation, all of them used this same drive. And so what's nice is that I have been able to, store a couple of replacement parts, had some junk machines or whatnot. And so any of these parts that go, generally I'll have another optic kicking around. I'll have another one of these kicking around. I'll have some gears kicking around, and so it's very nice to be able to have some parts, common parts for these things that can be found across different manufacturers. So I'm going to take it that this is actually a pretty good assembly, and that I'm going to try to get a list going of possibly all the different CD player makes and models that have used this Sony drive, because I have to assume that there's quite a few, since I've run across several companies using the same drive. So anyway, thank you for tuning in, and I appreciate your loyalty. Thank you for my new subscribers, and I hope I could be helpful for somebody today in saving one of those lovely old players from the 80s, 90s, or even 2000s. Nowadays, I think that they're switching up on things and using more DVD drives. They seem to be a lighter, maybe not as robust drive, and harder to work on, and I'm not quite sure about finding the parts for those. I'm guessing that things are changing a bit, and that Sony's old Japan drives, I'll call these, are sort of being phased out in favor of a cheaper Chinese drive that, in my opinion, is not as good. So your mileage may vary. Thanks again. Look forward to talking with you soon, and God bless you.